Okay, so what we have here is our class employee, which contains four instance variables: ID number, first name, last name, middle initial. Okay, we have constructors, the default, and the constructor with parameters, the setters and getters for each of the instance variables. And here in the test employee or the client class, we have the objects gardener and guard. Gardener and guard values are being set here. Okay, for the gardener, and the guard is being set here. Okay, so each of the values are being set through the setters. Okay, it's like set ID number, set first name, set last name, set middle initial, and print the gardener's info. And here, to set the guard's info, we have set ID number, of course, using the guard object. Guard.set fname to set the first name of the guard to Andres. And the guard's last name is Bonifacio. The guard's middle initial is set to he. Now, as alternative for this, you can use the constructors in setting the values for each of the employee's object, like passing the values to the constructor with parameters. That is, at this time, the ID number is being set to the ID number of the employee. Okay, and we can set to the value of the fname, okay, to the instance variable fname. Okay, using the this reference, so you'll say f.fname is equal to fname. That is, whatever being passed as argument will be passed to the value for the instance variable fname. All right, so now setting the last name, so we'll say this dot lname is equal to lname. And the middle initial, this dot mi is equal to mi. Sorry. Just here, equal to mi. Okay, now, since we have the complete items here, okay, we can use the constructor with parameters in setting the values for each of the employees. Okay, like for example, the gardener. So for the gardener, for the ID number, okay, we can put it here. Then the first name, and put it here. Last name, it here. And lastly is the middle initial. Okay, and here you can remove this one. Okay, and for this one, if ever, we'll just try to put this one to any instance method to the class employee, that is putting another method like display. And for each of the employees info will be here. Like instead of the specific name, like the generic name, employee info, ID number, F name, MIL name. Now, since get name, get F name, get ID number, or and a get middle initial is already accessible in this class, we can remove this gardener. Okay, and for this, we'll just call this display method in our client class. Here, we're going to remove this one and display the info of the guard. I mean the gardener using the object gardener dot the method display. And this one, we can remove this one by having or by calling the display method for the specific object. In this case, we have guard dot display. Okay, but since we don't have arguments being passed inside this instantiation, so the default constructor is being called for this case. Let's try to evaluate the default constructor. In the default constructor, no values are being set in this default constructor method. Okay? So, for example, for the default constructor, you will set the ID number, for example, to 9999, then F name to NA, for example, for the default value. For the L name is equal to NA, for example, and for middle initial is equal to empty character, 0. Okay. So it's up to you or it's up to the programmer on what values will be set as the default values. Okay, if ever the problem specifying your info as a default value, so your infos must be put inside the default constructor. Okay, in this case, since there are no arguments being set for the guard, the default values of the guard will be displayed. Save. Let's try to, since we have modified this class, we have to compile it first. And compile the client class, test employee. Okay, and as you can see, the info of the gardener is being displayed in the name of Jose Rizal. And the guard is in A. Okay, so for example, we have to pass For the guard, and this is Andres, and the last name is Bonifacio, and the middle initial is C, for example. So we're going to expect these values to be displayed for the guard. Save, file, and run. Okay, now let's try to apply the decision making logic for our method. And for this demonstration, we have to verify the employee ID number. Okay, for example, in here, before setting the ID number from the argument to the instance variable, we have to verify. Okay, so for example, if this value, okay, for example, since we involved and set the ID number of 9999, so there are four digits combination for the ID number. If mulapas na gani siya og 4 digits, it will not be accepted on the system. So since we have to limit the ID numbers to only contain 4 digits, we have to evaluate it here that if ID number is less than or equal to 9999, then we can set the ID number to the instance variable of ID number. Else, set the ID number to the default one. Okay? The default one, which is 9999. I mean, for example, for the default, four combinations of zeros. Okay? Which is, since we are having an integer, of course, the zero value will be assigned to the ID number. Okay? So, if it's greater than the four number digit combination, it will be assigned to 0. Okay, save and compile. And in the client class, just to verify the values for the guard, for example, okay, just to check that there must be only four number combination for the ID number. So we have to put 10,000 for the guard's ID number, okay, just to verify. And this will limit that the ID number to just only 9,999. Try to save, file, and run. Since we have passed 10,000 to the ID number of the guard, it's being set to 0 since it exceeds the limit of 9999. Okay?